23 kilometers southeast of the Australian base at Nui Dat. The long high mountains rose from the coastal plains like the jagged spine of some ancient beast. From the air, the massif appeared deceptively small, a mere 14 kilometers of jungle-covered limestone extending aggressively toward the South China Sea. American aerial reconnaissance had photographed every single square meter of this terrain. United States bombers had dropped over 40,000 tons of explosive ordnance on its steep slopes between 1966 and 1968. Yet, the mountain remained completely untamed and remarkably defiant against conventional military supremacy. The formidable 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines had aggressively conducted 3 major military operations directly into its treacherous northern approaches, and yet, despite overwhelming American firepower, the Viet Cong's highly disciplined D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion continued to operate from its deep caves and intricate tunnel complexes with absolute, maddening impunity. What the Americans simply did not understand, through the rigid lens of conventional military doctrine, was that the long high mountains were never just a static geographical position to be forcefully taken. The area was a living, breathing organism actively resisting every single foreign intrusion. This terrifying terrain was a vast network of subterranean underground rivers, ancient limestone caverns, and deep tunnel systems that had been painstakingly expanded and fortified for over 2 uninterrupted decades. The dedicated Viet Cong soldiers had not simply dug into these imposing mountains to hide from American aircraft. They had literally become a fundamental part of the stone and jungle themselves. But this geographical reality was only the very first layer of a chilling, classified mystery that would thoroughly consume American military intelligence officers for the next 3 bloody years of the Vietnam conflict. In the sweltering heat of March 1967, a heavily armed company from the prestigious United States 173rd Airborne Brigade confidently attempted a standard sweep and clear operation. They marched deliberately through the dense foliage of the Long Hai's eastern approaches, expecting a conventional engagement with the enemy. What actually happened over the agonizing course of the following 72 hours would ultimately result in the entire disastrous operation being permanently classified at the very highest levels of military assistance command. Vietnam, it was a tactical failure too horrifying to be publicly acknowledged. 47 elite American paratroopers confidently walked directly into this suffocating, claustrophobic jungle canopy. Only 19 completely traumatized men managed to walk back out alive. The remaining missing soldiers had absolutely not been killed by any conventional enemy ambush or standard explosive booby traps. They had simply and inexplicably vanished into the oppressive green shadows. Their bodies were mysteriously never recovered by frantic rescue teams. Their ultimate fates remained completely unknown, their names tragically added to the growing missing in action rolls that would continuously haunt devastated American families for many agonizing decades to come. The official military after-action report conveniently attributed these catastrophic personnel losses to standard enemy action and extremely complex, unforgiving terrain. However, the deeply disturbing unofficial assessment, securely circulated exclusively among highly cleared senior intelligence officers, told a vastly different and far more terrifying story. The seasoned Viet Cong fighters had not actually fought the heavily armed Americans in any traditional sense. Instead, they had hunted them systematically and patiently. The unseen enemy was methodically pulling screaming men directly from their established patrol lines without a single solitary gunshot ever being fired into the jungle. This horrific realization was the precise defining moment when the American High Command abruptly made a desperate strategic decision that would remain securely buried inside classified government archives for over 40 years. A thick red line was decisively drawn across the operational maps. The deadly Long High Mountains were officially declared strictly off-limits to all conventional American ground forces. United States Marines were absolutely forbidden to ever set foot inside that specific, terrifying jungle zone again. It was a silent admission of profound tactical defeat delivered by an invisible enemy hiding beneath the limestone. However, ignoring the mountain unfortunately did not magically solve the immense tactical problem plaguing the surrounding coastal plains. The emboldened soldiers of the D-445 Provincial Mobile Battalion continuously utilized their secure mountain fortress to consistently launch devastating surprise attacks against vulnerable Allied military positions. Someone eventually had to deal with this massive, bleeding wound in the regional security sector. Enter the remarkably unconventional forces of the Australian military. The Pentagon was forced to reluctantly look toward a tiny allied nation that most everyday Americans could not even accurately locate on a standard world map. To properly comprehend why the mighty American military establishment desperately turned to a microscopic force of barely 500 deployed men to miraculously accomplish what 20,000 heavily armed United States Marines fundamentally could not, one must thoroughly examine history. One must first deeply understand the entirely peculiar, distinct nature of the Australian military presence actively operating inside the volatile jungles of Vietnam. The first specialized Australian task force had originally arrived in the embattled Phuoc Tuy province back in 1966 with an incredibly unique operational mandate that defied standard American expectations. This distinct Australian military mandate differed fundamentally and completely from the rigid, numbers-driven American operational combat doctrine. While the massive United States armed forces constantly measured their strategic success through gruesome enemy body counts and the physical amount of contested territory violently seized, the deployed Australians had been handed a remarkably single, focused objective. They were instructed to completely pacify the chaotic Phuoc Tuy province, using absolutely whatever unconventional methods they personally deemed practically necessary. The absolute most important key word in this entire broad military directive was always the specific word whatever. Operating quietly and anonymously deep within the larger framework of the deployed Australian task force was a highly specialized combat unit so incredibly small that it barely even registered on any massive American organizational tracking charts. This unique element was the Special Air Service Regiment, widely known simply as the SAS. They maintained merely 3 tiny operational squadrons constantly rotating through the brutal Vietnam deployment cycle. There were essentially never more than 150 fiercely trained men actively serving inside the entire hostile country at any given point in the long, bloody war. Their incredibly mundane official military designation on standard paperwork was politely listed as simple long-range reconnaissance. However, their actual terrifying function out inside the suffocating jungle canopy was something fundamentally far more primal and deeply disturbing. It was an incredibly brutal methodology that would easily make hardened, ruthless American intelligence interrogators working at the infamous Phoenix program look like absolute amateur civilian enthusiasts. These fiercely independent Australian operators were fundamentally preparing to actively enter the forbidden red zone and systematically unleash absolute psychological hell upon the completely unsuspecting Viet Cong Mountain Battalion. Captain William Billy Dundas had commanded the Australian 2nd Squadron Special Air Service since the tense month of February 1968. A rugged former sheep station manager hailing from the vast expanses of rural Queensland, Dundas had never actually seen active combat before his initial deployment. His first crucial tour of duty occurred deep in the unforgiving Borneo jungles during the chaotic Indonesian confrontation of 1965. What he meticulously learned in those dense, suffocating Borneo jungles would forever alter his distinct approach to modern warfare. Tracking communist insurgents through incredibly thick terrain transformed him completely. Dundas rapidly evolved into something that the entrenched Viet Cong forces had absolutely never encountered during their long decades of bloody resistance. He fundamentally understood that the rigid American approach to counterinsurgency in Vietnam unfortunately operated on a deeply flawed central principle. The massive United States military consistently sought to aggressively find the elusive enemy, forcefully fix them in a static position, and ultimately destroy them with utterly overwhelming aerial and artillery firepower. This conventional doctrine had successfully won the Second World War and contained forces in Korea. It had thoroughly crushed massive conventional armies across 3 entire continents. However, in the suffocating, triple canopy jungles of Southeast Asia, this massive conventional warfare doctrine contained one absolutely fatal, catastrophic flaw. A military force simply cannot effectively destroy what it cannot actually see. The seasoned Viet Cong commanders understood this critical vulnerability intimately. They had intensely studied standard American infantry tactics for many years before the very first United States Marine battalions ever confidently waded ashore at Da Nang. The communist forces accurately knew that the Americans always moved in massive, clumsy units that generated tremendous noise and consistently followed easily predictable operational patterns throughout the dense bush. Furthermore, The deeply entrenched enemy intimately knew that conventional American infantry heavily relied on massive artillery barrages and constant air support to blindly compensate for their severe tactical limitations. Against such a heavily armed but blind enemy, the suffocating jungle canopy itself seamlessly became the ultimate, devastating weapon. All the deeply concealed Viet Cong fighters genuinely had to do was patiently wait in the shadows. Conversely, the highly classified Australian Special Air Service operational doctrine completely inverted every single fundamental assumption of modern American warfare. They embraced an entirely different, chillingly quiet philosophy of jungle combat, where conventional American military commanders aggressively moved their troops in massive platoon or heavy company strength. Typical Australian reconnaissance patrols consisted of merely 5 highly trained men, where frustrated American units attempted to forcefully clear dense jungle foliage with toxic defoliants and burning napalm. The stealthy Australians painstakingly learned to glide silently through it without deliberately disturbing a single delicate leaf. Where the massive American war machine loudly announced its heavy presence with thunderous helicopter insertions and constant radio chatter, the Australians walked in silently from many kilometers away to establish deeply concealed, lethal ambush positions. These microscopic Australian teams would patiently wait in absolute terrifying silence for many agonizing days at a time. But the absolute most significant, profound difference, the specific chilling element that would deeply shock and profoundly disturb seasoned American military observers, lay not primarily in their physical tactics. It was deeply rooted in their fundamental psychological orientation. These specialized Australian Special Air Service operators absolutely did not see themselves as conventional soldiers conducting standard counterinsurgency military operations. They genuinely saw themselves as apex predators. And in the brutal reality of hunting, there is absolutely no such thing as a fair fight. The true, terrifying revelation of this predatory capability came not merely from Captain Dundas himself, but directly from the uniquely skilled men who quietly served under his command. It specifically emanated from a highly classified, specialized group whose very existence the polite Australian government would vehemently deny for many subsequent decades. These were the legendary Aboriginal trackers of the Australian Army. Private Dorian Walker was a remarkably quiet, intensely focused Pintupi man originating from the harsh, unforgiving Western Desert. He was secretly recruited into the conventional military structure through a shadowy program that officially did not actually exist anywhere. Private Walker and his ancient Aboriginal people had successfully survived for over 40,000 years in one of the absolute most brutal, unforgiving desert environments on Earth. They achieved this miraculous survival by painstakingly developing extraordinary sensory capabilities that modern Western military science still genuinely struggles to accurately explain or replicate today. Walker possessed the uncanny, terrifying ability to seamlessly track a fleeing man through a jungle canopy so incredibly dense that highly advanced American infrared electronic sensors registered absolutely nothing but a massive, confusing green blur on their expensive monitoring screens. His natural senses were unparalleled. This quiet Aboriginal soldier could effortlessly determine the exact age of an isolated human footprint to within a remarkably precise 6-hour window, simply by analyzing the subtle moisture content of the faintly disturbed vegetation. Even more astonishingly, he could accurately smell the distinct dietary mixture of a concealed Vietnamese soldier's rice and pungent Nuoc Mam fish sauce from over 400 meters downwind in the dense jungle. When the highly skilled Private Walker first quietly arrived at the sprawling Nui Dat military base in the sweltering month of April 1968, he immediately encountered deep institutional skepticism. The specifically assigned American military liaison officer permanently attached to the Australian task force was a highly experienced Military Assistance Command Vietnam captain named James Morrison. Upon observing the quiet, unassuming Private Walker, Captain Morrison immediately and arrogantly dismissed the entire highly classified Aboriginal tracker program as utterly useless, romantic colonial nostalgia. The very notion of utilizing indigenous Aboriginals to track human targets in a modern, mechanized Vietnam War genuinely seemed completely absurd to the highly decorated American officer. He openly mocked the strange concept during classified intelligence briefings with his incredibly annoyed Australian military counterparts. Captain Morrison confidently believed this program was merely a foolish relic of 19th-century frontier warfare awkwardly transplanted into the advanced, highly lethal age of modern helicopter gunships and sophisticated electronic ground sensors. You cannot seriously expect a desert nomad to outmaneuver a hardened Viet Cong battalion with a pointy stick, Morrison reportedly scoffed to Captain Dundas during a heated strategic planning session. He was absolutely convinced that superior American technology and overwhelming firepower were the only legitimate answers to the complex insurgent threat hiding deeply within the forbidden limestone caverns of the terrifying Long Hai Mountains. However, the deeply skeptical American liaison officer would be violently forced to completely revise this arrogant, dismissive tactical assessment exactly 17 short days later. This profound psychological shift would occur under incredibly terrifying, deeply disturbing operational circumstances that would ultimately result in his immediate, frantic request for an emergency transfer back to the perceived safety of standard American military command. The brutal reality of the suffocating Vietnamese jungle was about to violently collide with his rigid textbook expectations. The silent, invisible Aboriginal tracker was preparing to flawlessly demonstrate the truly horrifying ancient architecture of a master human hunter. The first documented American observation of Australian Special Air Service methods officially occurred on the 15th of June 1968. The deeply skeptical Captain Morrison reluctantly accompanied a highly classified five-man patrol directly into the dangerous northern approaches of the Long Hai Mountains. The heavily armed American liaison officer expected a standard, noisy infantry sweep through the treacherous jungle foliage. Instead, the small Australian element quietly departed the sprawling Nui Dat military base at precisely 0300 hours under the absolute cover of absolute darkness. They immediately moved entirely on foot through 8 kilometers of rubber plantation. Morrison immediately noted with profound confusion that these hardened Australians fundamentally moved differently than any conventional American combat unit he had ever previously served alongside. There was absolutely no whispered talking, absolutely no standard tactical hand signals, and literally no audible sound whatsoever as they penetrated the deep jungle fringe. The incredibly focused patrol leader communicated strictly through an incredibly subtle, highly developed system of light physical touches. A gentle tap on the shoulder instantly signaled a complete halt, while a slight pressure on the arm flawlessly indicated a sudden change in their collective tactical direction. These phantom movements were so incredibly subtle and perfectly integrated into the surrounding environment that the highly trained Captain Morrison frequently missed half of their vital nonverbal communications entirely. By the misty, humid dawn, they had silently covered 12 grueling kilometers and flawlessly established a concealed position overlooking a prominent trail intersection. Highly classified military intelligence confidently suggested this specific jungle pathway heavily served as a vital courier supply route for the entrenched Viet Cong forces. What terrifyingly happened next would directly form the chilling centerpiece of Captain Morrison's deeply disturbed, classified after-action intelligence report. The predatory Australians absolutely did not set up a conventional, textbook military ambush utilizing standard overlapping fields of suppressing fire. They stubbornly refused to dig defensive fighting positions or establish loud, easily identifiable perimeters that would immediately alert the hyper-vigilant enemy. Instead, 4 fully camouflaged men literally melted seamlessly into the thick undergrowth on either side of the narrow dirt trail. Meanwhile, the 5th crucial man, the quiet Aboriginal tracker Private Walker, slowly moved forward to meticulously examine the physical path itself, utilizing ancient methods that completely defied standard American military logic and modern tactical training. For 20 agonizing minutes, the indigenous tracker intensely studied the narrow jungle trail with profound, almost terrifying physical concentration. He occasionally lowered his painted face to within mere centimeters of the damp ground, audibly sniffing the humid air and delicately touching crushed vegetation with his sensitive fingertips. When he finally returned, Walker communicated something deeply profound to the focused patrol leader in a raspy whisper so incredibly soft that Captain Morrison literally could not hear it despite trembling nervously less than 2 meters away. The seasoned patrol leader simply nodded with chilling, absolute predatory understanding. The highly disciplined Australians instantly began slowly repositioning their heavily armed bodies with physical movements so incredibly slow and deliberate that they seemed almost practically geological to the highly stressed American. Observe. And then, the true psychological torture of the predatory ambush truly commenced. For 11 completely agonizing, unbroken hours, the 5 men remained absolutely frozen in the oppressive jungle heat, without making a single solitary sound. Morrison felt his own mind slowly fracturing under the profound strain of this terrifying, unnatural silence, desperately awaiting the violent collision between the hunted and the unseen jungle ghosts. Exactly 11 hours later, a highly trained 3-man Viet Cong courier team confidently walked directly into the center of the invisible ambush position. They absolutely never even suspected that the lethal Australians were patiently waiting there in the green shadows. The very first terrifying indication of mortal danger only came when the lead enemy courier heavily stepped on a carefully concealed, pressure-release detonator flawlessly connected to a deadly claymore mine. The explosive blast instantly shattered the oppressive silence, tearing through the dense foliage and instantly obliterating the unfortunate lead tracker in a sudden blinding flash. The entire bloody military engagement incredibly lasted a mere 4 terrifying seconds, from the initial violent explosion to the final lethal silence. 3 hardened enemy combatants were permanently eliminated with absolute clinical precision. There were absolutely 0 Australian tactical casualties during the incredibly brief, brutally efficient jungle slaughter. Furthermore, there were absolutely 0 conventional rifle shots violently fired that could potentially be heard by enemy patrols beyond a tight 50-meter operational radius. The subversion of American tactical expectations was profound, completely replacing a massive, drawn-out firefight with a surgical, silent execution that defied comprehension entirely. However, the extreme violence of the ambush was absolutely not the specific element that deeply disturbed the horrified American observer. What truly disturbed Captain Morrison entirely came immediately after the bloody slaughter had smoothly concluded. Standard American combat doctrine strictly called for immediate, rapid helicopter extraction following any direct kinetic contact with hostile enemy forces. The standard procedure was always to hit hard and get out fast before heavily armed enemy reinforcements inevitably arrived. But the completely unorthodox Australians casually operated under absolutely no such conventional, restrictive military constraints, while deep inside this forbidden zone, following the completely brutal ambush, the silent Australian patrol remained perfectly concealed in their strategic position for another agonizing 6 hours, coldly watching the blood-stained trail. At exactly 14:30 hours, a heavily armed 2nd Viet Cong element cautiously arrived. It was a nervous 7-man search team desperately sent to secretly investigate when the missing couriers ultimately failed to properly report their coordinates. They horrifyingly found the violently mangled bodies of their fallen comrades, deliberately arranged in a highly specific, deeply disturbing pattern that Morrison would carefully describe in his classified report as entirely ritualistic. The 3 completely dead couriers had been chillingly positioned, sitting perfectly upright against massive jungle trees, their lifeless eyes intentionally propped completely open. Their bloody weapons were carefully placed straight across their laps, precisely as if they were merely resting peacefully in the dense shadows. A single crisp playing card, the menacing ace of spades, had been meticulously tucked deep into each dead man's bloody collar. This terrifying psychological hook deeply penetrated the superstitious minds of the arriving Viet Cong search team, instantly destroying their mental composure and shattering their previously unwavering tactical discipline entirely. The extreme psychological effect, severely inflicted upon the terrified enemy search team, was both immediate and highly visible to the hidden hunters. Even from exactly 50 meters away in the dark brush, Morrison could easily see the sheer, unadulterated terror violently seizing their frantic physical movements. The panicked enemy soldiers wildly clustered together rather than properly spreading out into a standard defensive formation. They made completely frantic, desperate gestures as they hopelessly attempted to rationally comprehend exactly what dark supernatural force had violently slaughtered and then ritually mocked their seasoned comrades within their own fortress. One completely horrified Viet Cong soldier literally vomited uncontrollably onto the damp jungle floor, unable to process the macabre theatrical display before him. Another terrified guerrilla fighter suddenly began firing his weapon entirely blindly into the dense jungle foliage, desperately emptying his entire magazine at unseen, imaginary shadows. The utterly cold, practically invisible Australians quietly watched absolutely all of this frantic psychological deterioration unfold. They absolutely did not engage the extremely vulnerable, exposed search team with additional lethal fire. They simply observed as the completely broken Viet Cong desperately collected their dead and wildly retreated. They fled the bloody scene at exactly twice the frantic speed they had originally arrived, completely abandoning absolutely all pretense of standard tactical discipline in their absolute, overwhelming supernatural terror. Captain Morrison's highly classified intelligence report bluntly concluded with a single, deeply disturbed professional observation that would permanently echo through secretive intelligence assessments for many years. Morrison officially wrote that the Australian Special Air Service absolutely does not conduct standard tactical ambushes against the enemy. Instead, they coldly conduct pure psychological warfare operations, directly utilizing deceased enemy bodies as their primary, horrifying medium of daily communication. Morrison fiercely recommended a highly detailed, comprehensive study of these incredibly dark, highly effective operational methods by American military intelligence units immediately. However, he also firmly appended a completely desperate personal recommendation at the very bottom of his shocking classified document. He bluntly stated to his superiors that he absolutely did not ever wish to directly participate in any future joint operations alongside these extremely dangerous, completely unorthodox Australian forces again. The profound psychological hook was deeply set, completely revealing that these fearless, spectral hunters were practically monsters operating entirely outside the boundaries of human morality. But Morrison had only terrifyingly witnessed the absolute shallow surface of this chilling predatory doctrine. The true, horrifying depth of the deeply classified Australian Special Air Service methodology would not fully become apparent until the massive, clandestine Longhai operation commenced. During the sweltering month of October 1968, the complete, unforgiving machinery of their highly specialized reconnaissance doctrine violently revealed itself. The daring operation officially began with a shocking military intelligence assessment that rigid American analysts had immediately and arrogantly dismissed as functionally impossible and completely absurd. Highly classified Australian signals intercepts confidently suggested that the Season D 445 Battalion had somehow established a massive, regimental-sized operational headquarters deep within the Forbidden Mountain terrain. This was an incredibly vast, sophisticated underground complex, seamlessly housing not only hardened combat troops, but a fully functional, well-supplied field hospital. Furthermore, it contained a dedicated political cadre training center and a massive, deeply hidden arms cache easily sufficient to sustain heavy regional military operations for over 6 uninterrupted months without any outside resupply. Standard American military response options were severely limited and practically suicidal against such heavily fortified underground defenses. Massive B-52 bomber strikes had already consistently proven completely ineffective against these incredibly deep limestone cave networks. A conventional helicopter assault was considered absolute tactical suicide given the dense, highly integrated anti-aircraft machine gun positions violently covering every single conceivable aerial approach. Massive ground infantry operations essentially required thousands of heavily armed troops that the overstretched 3rd Marine Division simply could not afford to quickly spare without dangerously compromising other vital defensive positions. The incredibly audacious Australian tactical solution to this massive operational nightmare was brutally elegant in its fundamental simplicity and genuinely terrifying in its ultimate psychological implications. Rather than foolishly attempting to forcefully destroy the massive mountain complex with overwhelming kinetic firepower, these silent hunters decided to meticulously map every single hidden aspect of it. They would methodically document every secret entrance, every concealed exit, every vital supply route, and every single predictable personnel movement seamlessly flowing through the dark, suffocating jungle canopy. And they terrifyingly chose to successfully accomplish this impossible surveillance mission by utilizing isolated 5-man reconnaissance patrols, quietly operating entirely inside the Viet Cong's own heavily defended security perimeter. These phantom teams would ruthlessly remain deeply concealed in the hostile brush for grueling, unbroken periods lasting up to 3 entire weeks. Over the agonizing course of the following 4 bloody months, the fearless Australian Special Air Service flawlessly conducted precisely 17 highly classified, long-range reconnaissance patrols directly into the absolute heart of the forbidden Longhai Mountains. The massive volume of critical military intelligence they systematically gathered during these incredibly dangerous infiltrations would eventually fill over 3,000 dense pages of highly classified government reports. But far more significantly, their unseen, terrifying physical presence deeply inside the heavily fortified Forbidden Zone would violently produce a profound psychological effect. It was an absolutely devastating mental collapse that absolutely no measurable amount of heavy American artillery bombardment or constant aerial bombing could have ever practically achieved against this seasoned enemy force. The heavily entrenched Viet Cong defenders fundamentally began seeing terrifying, supernatural ghosts violently haunting their most secure sanctuaries. This chilling psychological phenomenon initially started with deeply disturbed frontline sentries, frantically reporting sudden, inexplicable jungle movement that simply left absolutely no physical trace behind. Exhausted night guards would frequently hear highly distinct, localized sounds in the oppressive darkness. A single snapped wooden twig or a sudden, sharp rustle of dense vegetation would instantly provoke intense searches. But the terrified soldiers miraculously found absolutely nothing when they violently investigated. Highly secure, established jungle patrol routes that had been flawlessly and safely utilized by the communist forces for many long years suddenly became invisible, horrific death traps. Hardened guerrilla soldiers were now inexplicably and silently disappearing during entirely routine logistical movements between their fortified cave complexes. The highly detailed, official D-445 Battalion operational daily log from this exact tense period was permanently captured by Allied forces immediately after the bloody war. It chillingly reveals a completely shattered military unit rapidly descending into absolute, inescapable collective paranoia. The haunting log entry from November 3rd vividly states, "3 dedicated comrades completely failed to return from a routine daytime water collection detail. An immediate, heavily armed search violently swept the surrounding jungle but found absolutely no dead bodies, no spilled blood, and absolutely no physical evidence of conventional armed contact. The highly suspicious political officer firmly suspects cowardly desertion under the growing psychological pressure. However, the deeply terrified unit commander firmly believes otherwise, suspecting dark supernatural forces are violently hunting his highly trained men." The chilling daily entry from November 7th further violently illustrates the rapidly deteriorating psychological situation gripping the mountain fortress. Sentry Position 4 frantically reported a terrifying, unseen physical presence moving smoothly in the dense jungle undergrowth at precisely 0200 hours. Immediate flare illumination violently lit the dark canopy but incredibly revealed absolutely nothing. The missing sentry was finally discovered completely dead at dawn, his throat surgically cut. Absolutely no sound was ever heard by highly alert adjacent defensive positions merely 15 meters away. The desperate, highly classified entry from November 12th effectively signals the absolute tactical collapse of the formidable insurgent unit. Unseen terrors violently forced the unit commander to officially restrict absolutely all personnel movement strictly to safe daylight hours only. The completely panicked commander desperately requests immediate, heavy reinforcement from the seasoned 274th Regiment. The frantic emergency request was instantly denied by higher headquarters because the specific geographical area was still confidently considered completely secure from all standard American military ground operations. But this forbidden territory was absolutely not secure from the deeply terrifying, silent Australian psychological operations violently tearing through the green shadows. What the shattered D-445 Battalion fundamentally did not know, and simply could not rationally comprehend, was the terrifying nature of their relentless hunters. The invisible men violently stalking them had rigorously learned their deadly craft not from standard military academies. They learned from ancient aboriginal trackers whose ancestors had been continuously pursuing elusive prey through highly hostile terrain since long before the Great Pyramids were built. Private Walker had meticulously and silently identified 17 entirely separate, highly trafficked jungle runs, weaving seamlessly through the dense Longhai terrain. These were highly habitual, predictable dirt paths continuously used by heavily armed Viet Cong personnel, casually moving between their deeply fortified cave complexes. Like standard animal trails in the harsh Australian bush, These runs heavily represented the vital, accumulated wisdom of hundreds of safe movements. They were exactly the specific paths of absolute least resistance through the violently dense, unforgiving Vietnamese jungle vegetation. And like any masterful apex hunter, the silent walker innately knew that the absolute best place to patiently wait for unsuspecting prey was directly along these established runs. The disciplined Australians deliberately did not attempt to forcefully close these specific paths or violently ambush every single enemy movement they observed. That aggressive approach would have been tactically inefficient and highly dangerous. Instead, they ruthlessly selected 2 or 3 incredibly high-value jungle runs and flawlessly turned them into completely horrifying, highly lethal psychological killing grounds. They consistently executed these silent, extremely lethal ambushes by striking entirely unpredictably, and then rapidly withdrawing completely before the frantic enemy could ever effectively respond. The devastating operational effect was absolutely not primarily measured in a gruesome physical body count, although the impressive Australian kill ratios in the Long Hai would eventually reach an unprecedented 17-1. By the cold month of December 1968, the deeply traumatized D-445 Battalion had effectively and permanently ceased all major offensive military operations in the volatile region. By the vibrant spring of 1969, the imposing Long Hai Mountains had effectively and completely become undisputed Australian territory. This was absolutely not because the deeply entrenched Viet Cong forces had been entirely physically eliminated from the dense jungle. The heavily armed enemy combatants stubbornly remained hidden deep inside their ancient limestone cave complexes, desperately nursing their severely reduced operational capabilities and completely shattered collective morale. But the quiet Australians had successfully achieved something profound that massive American forces had absolutely not managed to accomplish anywhere else in the entire country of Vietnam. These invisible hunters had secured absolute, terrifying psychological dominance over a highly defined, deeply contested operational combat area. The undeniable historical evidence could be easily seen in massive stacks of captured enemy documents and highly detailed classified prisoner interrogation reports. It was blatantly obvious in the highly observable, deeply paranoid tactical behavior of seasoned enemy units desperately operating throughout the volatile Phuoc Tuy province. The formidable D-445 Battalion had been violently neutralized not through standard military attrition, but through the deliberate, systematic application of absolute, unadulterated psychological terror by an unseen enemy force. Their deeply traumatized guerrilla soldiers absolutely refused to conduct standard combat patrols in any jungle areas where the phantom Australian Special Air Service had been recently reported. Their frustrated, desperate unit commanders furiously issued direct tactical orders that essentially went completely unexecuted because their terrified subordinates were simply too paralyzed by sheer supernatural fright to enter the dark foliage. Their highly dedicated political cadre fundamentally struggled to desperately maintain the optimistic communist narrative of inevitable military victory when seasoned men were continuously vanishing without a trace from positions that should have been completely secure. However, this unprecedented, massive tactical success unfortunately came at an incredibly steep human cost that polite Australian government authorities would continuously spend decades desperately attempting to minimize. The highly specialized men who painstakingly learned to silently hunt other humans in the terrifying Long Hai Mountains absolutely did not simply return to peaceful sheep farming and mundane factory work when their grueling combat tours finally ended. They permanently carried something profoundly dark back home with them across the ocean. It was a severe psychological adaptation to extreme intimate violence that polite civilian society could simply never comfortably accommodate. Tragic post-traumatic stress casualty rates among these highly specialized Australian Vietnam veterans would eventually far exceed those of their conventional American military counterparts. This devastating psychological fallout occurred despite the fact that the Australians officially served in vastly smaller total numbers and miraculously sustained significantly fewer physical combat casualties during the bloody conflict. The exact same profound psychological transformation that effectively made them incredibly devastating. Highly lethal jungle operators unfortunately also made them complete, alienated strangers existing quietly within their own peaceful hometown communities. They had successfully learned to constantly think exactly like apex predators, and as history consistently proves, Deadly apex predators absolutely do not ever easily return to peacefully grazing alongside the oblivious, vulnerable civilian herd. The final, highly comprehensive American military assessment regarding these completely unorthodox Australian Special Air Service jungle operations in Vietnam would not be officially completed until 1974. This was fully 3 entire years after the absolute last heavily armed Australian combat troops had permanently departed the blood-soaked Southeast Asian theater. The deeply controversial, highly critical document was immediately classified strictly top secret by the extremely nervous United States Pentagon leadership. This incredibly sensitive intelligence report was highly restricted and exclusively distributed to fewer than 50 carefully selected senior military recipients. The detailed document bluntly reached profound tactical conclusions that directly and completely contradicted absolutely everything traditional American military doctrine had previously assumed regarding counterinsurgency warfare. First, it definitively proved that highly trained, small unit combat operations fundamentally achieved vastly superior strategic results compared to massive, clumsy conventional infantry operations, heavily supported by overwhelming, indiscriminate aerial firepower. The highly lethal Australian Special Air Service officially achieved an unprecedented kill ratio of roughly 17-1. This staggering lethality completely dwarfed the conventional American infantry average, which hovered tragically around a simple 1-to-1 ratio during dense jungle engagements. Second, the report boldly stated that ancient indigenous tracking methods, specifically utilizing highly adapted Aboriginal techniques, seamlessly integrated into modern jungle warfare, provided extraordinary intelligence capabilities. These primal, highly effective human sensory skills were something that absolutely no expensive, highly advanced technological surveillance system could ever truly hope to perfectly replicate. Desperate American proposals to rapidly recruit skilled Native American trackers for heavily modeled, similar classified military programs were immediately submitted. However, these desperate American indigenous tracking proposals were ultimately never officially implemented by the rigid, highly traditional military establishment. Third, the classified assessment strongly emphasized that deliberate, highly targeted psychological warfare operations, precisely attacking enemy morale, could successfully achieve massive strategic effects, entirely disproportionate to the minimal physical resources originally invested. A single, highly trained 5-man Australian reconnaissance patrol, seamlessly operating completely undetected for 2 agonizing weeks, could systematically degrade enemy combat effectiveness significantly more than a massively expensive, incredibly loud, battalion-sized sweep and clear infantry operation utilizing thunderous, continuous artillery bombardment. Fourth, and unquestionably most controversially, the shocking intelligence report brutally acknowledged that these highly unorthodox Australian combat methods successfully achieved these miraculous strategic results while quietly operating under significantly fewer moral restrictions than standard American combat forces. The highly sensitive, deeply classified intelligence annex meticulously noted that certain deeply disturbing Australian battlefield practices directly regarding the ritualistic, terrifying treatment of enemy combat dead would absolutely violate Standard Military Assistance Command Vietnam standing directives if directly conducted by any uniformed United States military personnel. This highly radioactive final point would permanently ensure deep, impenetrable historical classification. The nervous American Pentagon firmly had absolutely no political interest in publicly broadcasting the highly embarrassing, incredibly awkward historical fact that their absolute most effective strategic military allies in the bloody Vietnam conflict had ultimately succeeded largely by systematically doing horrific things that conventional American combat forces were strictly prohibited from legally doing. The looming domestic political implications were simply far too incredibly dangerous for the fragile government to practically manage. The heavy, dark moral implications surrounding these brutal predatory tactics were simply far too profoundly uncomfortable for the standard traditional military academy leadership to properly digest. It was considered vastly better to safely let the remarkable, highly terrifying Australian military contribution quietly fade into deep, impenetrable historical obscurity. It would remain a shadowy ghost story solely remembered by the deeply traumatized, silent combat veterans who had personally served alongside these fearsome jungle phantoms. Today, elite special operations forces operating around the entire globe intensely. Study these specific Australian Special Air Service combat methods from the dense Vietnam jungles as absolutely prime historical examples of highly lethal, completely unconventional psychological warfare functioning at its absolute most devastatingly effective, terrifying operational peak. The highly successful indigenous tracker training programs, the incredibly dark psychological warfare operations, and the deeply controversial long-range patrol doctrines have absolutely all been systematically incorporated into modern special forces training curriculums. What was once universally officially classified as simply far too politically and morally controversial to ever publicly acknowledge has miraculously become the absolute standard, highly respected textbook curriculum, heavily taught at prestigious military installations like Fort Bragg and Coronado. The brutal, unforgiving tactical lessons painstakingly extracted from the terrifying Longhai Mountains perfectly formed the modern foundational bedrock for contemporary elite counterinsurgency units. Yet despite this massive modern institutional embrace of their physical combat tactics, the true terrifying essence of the original Australian hunters remains completely elusive to contemporary military planners. The profound, deeply unsettling psychological transformation that successfully turns ordinary, peaceful sheep farmers into terrifying, utterly invisible jungle phantoms simply cannot be mass-produced in a modern, highly sanitized corporate military training environment. The absolute, unshakable willingness to seamlessly become something entirely different, something completely other than a standard, morally constrained conventional soldier, fundamentally requires a terrifyingly dark leap of deep human psychological faith that few modern men possess. It actively requires the chilling, absolute acceptance that effectively hunting another human being in the dense, suffocating bush fundamentally requires successfully becoming an apex predator deep within your own very soul, and absolutely not merely executing highly rehearsed tactical movements learned in your standard military training. The modern American operator is heavily burdened by restrictive modern rules of standard engagement, massive layers of heavy bureaucratic oversight, and the constant, glaring eye of advanced, highly intrusive modern digital technology, monitoring their every single tactical combat movement across the sprawling modern, highly sanitized, heavily monitored global battlefield. The Australian jungle ghosts operating deeply within the terrifying shadows of the Longhai Mountains tragically and effectively possessed absolutely none of those modern, restrictive bureaucratic constraints during their bloody, deeply classified operational deployments. They were fundamentally and completely cut off from the polite, moral civilian world, heavily existing entirely within a terrifying, primal state of absolute, pure predatory nature, where the only absolute defining law was swift, silent survival at absolutely any terrible psychological cost necessary. This terrifying absolute freedom from standard human morality ultimately became their most powerful, deeply devastating psychological weapon. Private Dorian Walker quietly returned to the vast Australian continent in 1970 and resolutely never served another single day in the modern military again. He peacefully spent his remaining quiet years living deep in the harsh western desert, continuously remaining completely silent about his dark actions. When eager, highly educated academic researchers desperately attempted to formally interview the quiet veteran regarding profound Aboriginal military contributions to the brutal war effort, he completely and stubbornly refused. That dark, bloody knowledge absolutely belongs solely to the deep jungle, he reportedly told one incredibly persistent, highly frustrated historian, firmly insisting that the terrifying secrets must permanently remain deeply buried there. Captain William Dundas remained highly active in the conventional Australian Army until 1982, successfully commanding various specialized elite units through the massive, highly complex, post-Vietnam military organizational restructuring period. His highly classified, intensely detailed military lectures regarding unconventional jungle warfare methodology firmly remain absolutely mandatory, required reading at the prestigious Australian Defence Force Academy today. He peacefully passed away in 2015, though his complete, astonishing contribution to modern Australian military history remains stubbornly, frustratingly partially classified by the government. And Captain James Morrison, the deeply disturbed American military observer who terrifyingly witnessed things in the dark Longhai Mountains that violently changed his fundamental understanding of modern warfare forever, eventually returned home to the United States forever completely changed. He successfully completed his grueling combat tour with the highly classified military command, quietly returned to the peaceful United States, and resolutely never spoke publicly about his deeply terrifying, deeply profound experiences alongside the phantom Australian Special Air Service. His deeply disturbing, highly detailed after-action intelligence reports, however, miraculously survived completely intact deep within the heavily guarded, classified government archives. They permanently stand as a chilling, profound historical testament to brutally effective predatory combat methods that the standard American military doctrine was simply not fundamentally prepared to openly adopt or ever officially acknowledge.